What is the purpose of money? Why do we need it? Why do people spend all of their lives chasing money and trying to attain more and more of it? The truth is that we need money to pay for our expenses. Our food, energy, and shelter bills add up, so we go to work every day to be able to pay those off. But what if there was a solution? What if suddenly we didn't have those bills anymore? What if we could drastically reduce our monthly expenses? Welcome to the Money GPS strategy. You came here for the truth. Today, we are going to talk about self-sufficiency. This is what I discussed in my second book, Global Economic Collapse. Many people ask, how is this ever going to be resolved? Every 7 years approximately, there is some sort of financial calamity, a recession or worse. And people watch their wealth rise and fall with the markets. They are invested in a particular asset, whether that's paper assets, whether that's precious metals or real estate, and they watch this go up and down. So some nights they're sleeping well and others not so good. Now, the strategy that I have devised is to get away from the monetary system altogether. Now, perhaps not off the grid, but self-sufficient. And that's what we'll talk about today. Let's begin. This is just a little picture that I got from online, and I did a little Photoshop work here, copy and pasting images. And essentially what I'm showing you here is a home that's in a more rural area, perhaps rural residential, and is next to a body of water. Now, you don't have to live in the middle of nowhere for this to work. And that's what I really want to get into. Essentially, you need to be out of the city centers. It doesn't have to be far out, but it will be a good idea to get out of the major metropolis. Generally, you don't get enough land, and you are too close to congested. And this is a problem. Resources are too tight in the megacities. So, of course, this is not to scale at all, and this is simply just to be a diagram to explain what I need to. So, you're going to have your home, and whatever that means to you, however large it is, and the amenities you want. But some of the things that you'll need in a home are, for example, water. Now, you may have some sort of water available in the home, and that would be for your sewers, for example. A lot of these places in the more rural areas, they tend to have septic tanks. So that would take care of the waste, and this is a good idea to have. Some areas, they have sewers available, but perhaps not to the property. So maybe your neighbor down the street has this sewer, and you would have to pay for that line to be installed to be brought to your property. And depending on the earth that you have in your area, depending on how far it is, there's costs that you incur. Is it worth it? Perhaps that's up to you to decide. But these are things that you need to inquire about. The cost is a huge variance, of course. So look into this. Water, there's different types. That's the one being the sewage, waste disposal, whether that is with a septic, whether that is with a sewer system. I also wanted to get into water catchment. Water catchment is very, very important. This can be on a very small scale or it can be on a larger scale. Small scale, perhaps you have a rain barrel, catches the water, and you would be able to then water your plants with it, for example. Great idea. So generally what happens, for those who don't know, is off of the rooftop, you would catch water into a big container of some sort. And the bigger the container, the more you can do with it. But of course, the larger the container, the more upfront cost, as well as the fact that you are able to provide more water for different things in the house. Maybe that's the only source of water you need is available there. But of course, that can be expensive. It requires maintenance. You would need some sort of UV light. You would need filtration on that. There's expenses, of course, and it provides you, most importantly, with self-sufficiency related to water. Now, as I've said, this all depends on how much upfront costs you want so that long-term you become self-sufficient. Now, maybe this isn't the only source of water. What about well water? Many properties in rural areas already have wells, but it depends on, again, the earth. Maybe there's a very, very hard rock underneath. Depends on the soil you're going through. Depends how deep you need to have to go. There are various things that need to be considered with well water. You don't even know if that water is going to be good enough where you're digging in. But it's a good way to be able to provide yourself with a type of water. So if you can get good water out of a well and you feel that the costs that you'll incur digging out this well are beneficial to you, then you could do that. So also having both methods is excellent. So I'll get into this just for a moment here. I'll interject. The reason this is different than basically living off-grid is that individuals can have all of the modern amenities. They can even pay monthly bills for certain things, but they're not reliant on them. So suddenly we take the power back. We don't need that monetary system. So let's say, for example, with the water, I'm able to provide myself with water in times when the water supply is contaminated. How many cities have you heard that their water supply has been contaminated? Not just with all the things that are running through our tap water supply. I'm just talking about the areas that have, unfortunately, their water supply has been poisoned. It happens. So you would be able to provide your own supply of water, maybe for you, maybe even for your neighbors if you'd like to, maybe for your family. You could do that. So I think this is important. It's not considered enough because the price of water generally is cheap. So when you live in many cities around the world, you can get water for cheap. It's not an expense that people even think about. But what happens when that supply is disrupted? Then all of a sudden, water becomes very expensive. Look at all these hurricanes. Water sells off the shelves very quickly. The price goes through the roof. What if you had your own? You wouldn't need to worry about that, okay? So you hear what I'm talking about with water. And last but not least, just wanted to mention that it is very beneficial, and it has negatives as well, to live near a body of water. If you're on a river, or you have some sort of stream, or you have a lake, you want a fresh water supply. And maybe it's not the highest quality, but just having it available is very, very good. Now, all of a sudden, to water all your plants, for example, you've never needed to use water from the tap. Never needed to use one penny, one dime to be able to water any of that. You would just go to your supply and you use that to water everything. That would save money. Sure, maybe not today or tomorrow you would see the savings, but in a long-term scenario, of course you do, as well as the fact that you don't need to worry about any sort of problems that are in the water supply. You're providing that for yourself. And I would also like to mention the fact that at least in some areas of the world, there is in Ontario, in Canada, they have these laws, and I know that other places do as well. There are certain conservation or farmland or sort of special arrangements, particular land, that you can get tax back. So your property taxes, you'll get them back if you live on a particular property. So make sure you investigate. If you're thinking about buying into a property, investigate this. Your property taxes, let's say you're paying $5,000 a year, you can often get 75% of that back, 50% of that back, or even in some cases 100% of that tax money you pay every single year back if your property meets certain criteria. If you are a farm and you produce just, I think it's $7,000 per year from your farm, you are able to get a very large percentage, I think it was 75%, back on your property taxes. So you're using that for agricultural land. In Hawaii, for example, they have a rule that is if it is zoned as agricultural, you'll get that money back. So let's say most of your property was sectioned off to be agricultural land. Maybe you had 2 sheep on it. Maybe you grew some crops on it. That's agricultural land. You get the city or the county or whatever it might be to come in. They would be able to assess it. They would zone the property accordingly. And even if that's your own property, you have a house on it and everything else, they work that out and you get your tax money back. So these are laws, depending on where you live, you need to investigate. I think it's so important, okay? I don't want to rant for too long here. Just knowing that a fresh water supply is important. Think about the tax incentives that you could get. Research them for the place that you live, whether it's maybe something in your city, maybe it's in your state. By the way, I wanted to mention the fact that if you live on a body of water, the stream coming through, that's very key. So investigate that, okay? Looking at this, solar panels. You want to be able to provide your own power, because when the lights go out, all of a sudden things get scary. But when the lights are on, everyone's fine. Nobody really minds. What if your power prices increase? Power is becoming very expensive in a lot of areas, and guess what? It continues to go up. So maybe you want to provide yourself with power, and you can use solar panels or other alternatives out there. Geothermal. Maybe you want wind power. There's so many different types, right? But the fact that you don't have to rely on the grid is something that I think is important. And you can take that solar, you can store it in batteries, and it would provide energy throughout the evening, maybe on cloudy days or what have you, okay? So that's just one thing. What I also think about is when the power goes out, we've had these instances in many cities. Power will be out for a day, maybe 2 days. All of a sudden, everything in your fridge or your freezer might have to be thrown away. So all those costs that you incurred, you bought all that food, all of a sudden it's garbage. So that's important, as well as the fact that if you have maybe elderly or maybe you have young children, you want to be able to make sure that they are warm throughout the cold months, or vice versa. Maybe it's extremely hot and you want them to be cooled down during the hot months, right? These are important things. These are insurance policies, essentially. So you can get 1 panel or something, or 2 panels or 3, or you can get many, many panels, and that would be able to provide more energy for you. Maybe you want more batteries to store more. It all depends on how much you want to incur up front, how much cost you want to incur, as well as the fact that you don't need to incur a single penny on your own out of your own pocket, right? There are many. First of all, I'll mention this. There are tax incentives, again, for those who are getting into solar. If you are going to purchase solar panels and even electric vehicles, for example, the government gives you money back in a lot of cities and a lot of countries out there, okay? The government's going to give you money. So look into those tax incentives. You'll get a lot of that, percentage-wise, a lot of it back by getting into alternative energy. At the same time, you get all the benefits. And then, on top of that, you don't even have to rely on it entirely. Maybe you're also connected to the grid. There's also something that I wanted to point out, is that there are many companies out there that will install solar panels on your roof for free. The catch is that any excess energy is sold back into the grid and they make the profit. For some people, they would say, that's a great idea. I'll do that, no problem. I don't want the extra money, but I don't really have any money to put up front. There's a lot of fine print there. There's a lot of things to know about that, but that's the idea. So I hope you get that. Provide your own energy and you don't need to worry. Okay, and last but not least, I just wanted to get into this here. Okay, we're talking about the food supply. And I put greenhouses here purposely. When you look at greenhouses, the reason I think this is so important is because many people say that where I live, you cannot grow food year round. Well, I personally live in Toronto, and it's a cold weather climate, and you can grow in unheated greenhouses year round, all 4 seasons. You have to choose the right crops, but it is possible. Unheated greenhouses are very important for those that want to have let's say they have their concerns about chemicals that are coming from the sky and in the environment too. You'd be able to provide yourself with the shelter from that, as well as You don't have to worry about pests, at least as much. You don't have to worry about the pests. You don't have to worry about any sort of animals coming in and eating your crops. Greenhouses can be purchased or built for very, very cheap, and they're unheated, so you're not going to incur any expenses with that. And this is something that I'm not an expert in, but if you want to check out the people who are, you can look at YouTube channels 1 Yard Revolution. That's one. He's in Chicago, that individual. And then there's also another individual who goes to different places around the world, and mostly in the US, I believe. And that is Growing Your Greens. So John Kohler on Growing Your Greens is someone very good as well. But the reason I mentioned 1 Yard Revolution is because he has greenhouses. He lives in Chicago, and he does this year round. So I would consider him an expert on that. Lots of tips. Check that out. Again, the reason you want this is because you want to provide your own food supply. Now, maybe you can't provide everything that you eat. But what if you could reduce your expenses, your food bills? And I assure you, if you had a few greenhouses or you just had a few plots of land, you can grow a lot of food in a surprisingly small area. You can see those YouTube channels, but also just looking around on YouTube, you'll find people who are growing in a very condensed environment, in a typical backyard, and they're able to provide themselves with a significant amount of the food that they eat. So, maybe I'll mention this. You also want lines of defense. I think that this is very important. You want to be able to have some sort of security around the border. Maybe you want a natural border, like a border worth of trees around the sides and everything else. You want to provide yourself with maybe some fencing. Maybe you want to put a concrete wall. I mean, it's up to you. But lines of defense are something that I think is also important because we worry. We're always worrying. And taking away that worry, I think, is worth something. It's worth a lot, to me anyway. So security is important too. There's so many different things with that, and I'll leave it up to you, depending on where you live and what's legal, let's say. But okay, so that's that. And essentially, I just wanted to quickly note, there's a difference between off-grid and self-sufficient. Those who are off-grid want to perhaps live in the middle of nowhere, and they give up certain things. Maybe they don't have a flush toilet. They can't have that. Maybe they can't have their, certain amenities that we're used to. Maybe there's no plowing of the streets where they live, or maybe you can't even access the roads during the winter time. There's different things, okay? But then there's self-sufficient. So maybe you live just half an hour outside the city and you can get to a place that looks a little bit like this. I think that would be great because you can provide yourself everything you need, yet a half an hour drive and you're there, you're in the city center. Depends on where you live. Maybe it takes you 2 hours to get to a place that's, the downtown core sort of thing. But you can probably get in most areas, most cities, in a half an hour drive, you can get to a city. Not even a town. You could probably get to a city. And that would be something that you can get what you need, maybe your supermarkets and maybe all of this stuff. That's another factor, okay? So there's a difference between off-grid and self-sufficiency. I talk about self-sufficiency in the Money GPS strategy in my new book, Global Economic Collapse. Then there's something that I touched on is the upfront costs versus the long-term stability. Look, if you're going to put in solar panels and wells and you're going to have greenhouses and everything else, these are costs that come to you up front. So of course, this is something that maybe not everyone can afford, but maybe you can't afford to put the greenhouse in yet, but maybe you can just get a few seeds and you can plant them in the ground for now. And then you can look online, you'll see do-it-yourself type greenhouses, and for maybe $100, you can build yourself a greenhouse. And the solar panels, maybe you can't afford to pay for them yourself now, but maybe you can get the guys to come in and put them up, and that would provide you that way. And maybe you don't have a well, but maybe you can get a barrel that you found somewhere or you got for free off of Kijiji, and you could start catching your water. So don't put everything down. Don't say, no, I can't do that, and have that sort of negative aspect, negative outlook. You can do this. You can do this. So this is important things. I talk about more in detail in my new book, but I wanted to give you this because so many people ask me, so I thought maybe I'll just do a video where I get into some of the topics from that book. Reduce your expenses, but maybe you can't necessarily eliminate your expenses. So what if you don't get that much sun where you live? All of a sudden, solar panels may not be able to provide 100% of your power. Well, that's okay. What if they provided 50% of your power? Or what if in the summer months they provided 100% of your power, but in the winter months only 30%? Well, that's okay, because that reduces your expenses by 30%, as well as the fact that if you're storing this in batteries, if the power went out, you're all good. Your family is doing well. And then maybe the power comes back on after a day, and maybe by then your battery is lost its charge, but it's okay because you're back on the grid. So that's what I think is important, to look at all these things, a holistic type of viewpoint on it. If you want more information, of course, it's in my books, but I thought I would bring this to you. I hope that you found it informative. People are always saying that, I have a negative look on this and everything, and the economy and everything else. This is me. This is my view of what is positive. That we can do this. Everybody can have this. We can have a piece of land for very cheap compared to what we get in the cities. We can have all of the modern amenities. We can have everything that's better than what our centralized systems can provide. Our power system can be way better than what we experience. In many cities, they have blackouts all the time. When you have your own solar panels, maybe you would be able to sustain that if you had enough batteries and things. You would be able to do that. And if your systems went out for whatever reason, you could use the grid as your backup. So yeah, you're going to incur costs, perhaps, but they'll be very low in relation to what you're paying today. Same with the food supply. It's contaminated. You know about all the things that I won't get into. The food supply isn't what it used to be, but you can provide some of your own. Water catchment, we don't have to worry about the pollution, the poisons, and everything else that's out there. And being on a body of water is something else that's beneficial. Having your own place to store the waste and everything else is also important. So many factors that I've discussed here, but there's so much more. If you found this video informative, please give me a thumbs up. I hope that you support me in this type of viewpoint, what I call the money GPS strategy. If you want to know more about that, there is always the place to go is that it's Amazon, where I have my books for sale. You can get on there, you can flip through them. The links are in the description below if you're interested. Just to cover very quickly, the first book is more about the money GPS formula, and what that is basically having your assets exceed your expenses. But then my next book, I talked about reducing your monthly expenses. So the two of them together make something very beautiful, and they really come together in that way. If you're interested, check out the links below. Take care.